All right, we're going to start off Unit 5 by talking about Thomas Jefferson, probably one of our more famous presidents. What's the first thing that comes to mind when you think of Thomas Jefferson? Anybody? Raise your hand. He's actually, I believe, is he on the 20 or the 5? I think he's on the 5. I'm not sure. I can double check that. All right. Oh, Abraham Lincoln's on the 5. Andrew Jackson's on the 20. No, Benjamin Franklin is on the 100. He is on the nickel, though. I know he's on the nickel. What else? Shh. Okay, exploration. So we'll talk more about like Lewis and Clark and the expedition that goes west. Anything else that comes to mind immediately when you think of Jefferson? Okay. Memorial. Okay. Now, Thomas Jefferson does have probably one of our more famous, he is probably one of our more famous presidents. Here is the Jefferson Memorial in Washington, D.C. Now, as a president, he had kind of a unique presidency. He was elected to 2 terms, and the first term was highlighted by things like buying Louisiana Purchase, also the Lewis and Clark expedition. His second term was not as good. There were some conflicts, some dealings with other countries. He made some kind of decisions that eventually ended up hurting the economy a little bit. But overall, Jefferson is probably one of our more famous presidents, and we'll kind of talk about him in general today, and also specifically about the first election that gets him elected president. So let's talk a little bit about the election of 1800 first. Now, we did not have the same political parties that we have today, back in 1800. Today we have the Republicans and the Democrats. Those are both relatively new political parties. The 2 political parties that existed in 1800 are the Federalists and then the Democratic Republicans. So I know that second one is probably confusing because that's kind of the 2 political parties we have today kind of morphed together in name only. But these were the 2 political parties that existed in 1800. Now, Thomas Jefferson is what number president? He's number 3, okay? Obviously, the first 2 presidents are George Washington, and who else? John Adams, okay? Now, George Washington was not a big fan of political parties. When the country was first formed, there really wasn't an idea of political parties, and they kind of just began to blossom as people kind of began to think alike on different areas and stuff. The first 2 presidents, George Washington and John Adams, would both be considered to be Federalist. Okay, so even though George Washington was not a big fan of political parties, in fact, he actually told people when he left office as president, don't get too involved with political parties. It's going to potentially ruin the country if you begin to think more like a political party instead of what's good for the country, which is very appropriate today, because today that's kind of one of the main things that people are upset about, is that people think as Republicans or Democrats. They don't think as leaders first. But I want you to understand that the first 2 presidents were Federalist, because that'll kind of make more sense as we talk about why this election of 1800 is kind of an important presidential election. So, presidential election of 1800, we have the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. Now, the 2 main candidates for the election of 1800 were John Adams. John Adams was the current president at the time, and then Thomas Jefferson was the Democratic Republican candidate. He was the vice president at the time to John Adams. So remember, we talked about how when we had the elections the first couple times, you had the person that got the most electoral college votes was president. The person that was the runner-up was vice president. They did not have to be from the same political party. So this is kind of crazy. You got the sitting president running against his current vice president, and they're both running to be the next president of the United States. Okay. Now, one of the things that the Federalists said about Jefferson to try and get people to not vote for him was they said, hey, he's from a different political party, he's got some different ideas, some different viewpoints and stuff, and they referred to him as a radical. They were trying to get people to kind of almost be afraid of voting for Jefferson because they were afraid of how much change would take place if a new political party came into power. The election of 1800 was particularly nasty. There was lots of mudslinging. They said some awful things about each other. Quite frankly, there's a lot of things they said about each other that I can't say in an 8th grade classroom. So when we think about elections today being kind of nasty and stuff, elections back in 1800 were nasty as well. Okay, So they referred to Jefferson as a radical to try and kind of scare people a little bit. Now, this is where things get kind of crazy in the election of 1800. The Democratic Republicans decided to not necessarily rig the election, but what they wanted was they wanted their guy to be president, and then they wanted somebody else from the same party to be vice president. Okay? So the Electoral College at this time voted for 2 people on each vote. Okay? So what they decided to do was they said, hey, we think we got enough votes to get Jefferson as president, but let's vote for somebody that we want to be vice president as the second person. But if everybody votes that way, it's going to end up as a tie. So we need one person to not vote for Aaron Burr as vice president, as the other person, and then we'll have all the votes for Jefferson minus one other vote for Burr, and so we'll get the president and the vice president in from the same political party. The problem was someone did not get the memo. Okay, so everybody that voted for Thomas Jefferson also voted for Aaron Burr, and so when they totaled them all up, it was tied. So both of them had 73 Electoral College votes. So now who gets to decide the election? Do you guys remember we talked about it a little bit earlier? No, not the vice president. They don't re-vote. A different group of people gets to vote. The House of Representatives. Okay, so now we have a completely different group of people that's going to get to break the tie here. So now the House of Representatives is going to vote, and a crazy thing happens when the House votes. It's tied the first time that they vote. So they vote again. It's tied a second time. They vote again. It's tied a third time. Over the course of like 6 or 7 days, they vote 35 times in a row, and it's tied every single time. The 36th time, someone changes their vote, and Thomas Jefferson gets elected president. Now, there's some belief that there was kind of some backroom dealing on, you know, hey, if you change your vote, we'll get you a good job or whatever like that. So on the 36 votes, finally, it's broken, the tie's broken, and that's how Thomas Jefferson becomes our 3rd president. So because of this, there are several amendments and stuff changed. We no longer vote for just like 2 people on each electoral college vote and then have like the runner-up be vice president and stuff. This is one of the reasons why when you vote now, you vote for the ticket. So like you vote for the guy that's president and the guy that's running with that person, or the woman that's running with that person, together. Okay, so this election did cause some things to change as far as the election process. All right, let's talk a little bit about Jefferson kind of as an individual. This is a famous quote from John F. Kennedy. When John F. Kennedy was president in the early 1960s, he had a famous dinner for all the Nobel Prize winners at the White House. So, you know, the people that win the Nobel Prize are like the best scientists, the best writers, the best humanitarians, okay? So you've got all these massively intelligent, talented people in this room. And John F. Kennedy stands up to give some remarks, and this is what he says. He says, "I think this is the most extraordinary collection of talent, of human knowledge that has ever gathered together at the White House, with the possible exception of when Thomas Jefferson dined alone." All right, so that's a pretty powerful statement, okay? So Thomas Jefferson, even if you don't think that his presidency was the greatest, the guy had a lot of different talents and abilities, and so we want to spend just a couple minutes kind of talking about those. So first of all, he was a lawyer. This was his job, okay? This is how he made his living. Was considered to be one of the best lawyers in Virginia. This is one of the reasons that he was invited to be a part of, you know, the creation of the Declaration of Independence. He knew law, he could write, he was very intelligent as far as government and law goes. Now, besides being a lawyer, he was also an accomplished architect. So when you look at the nickel, and I'll pass this nickel around here, on the nickel, and there's a couple different kinds of nickels. This is just kind of the common one. So on the nickel, you've got Thomas Jefferson on one side, and then you've got the house that he designed, Monticello, on the back side. So Monticello is a house that you've probably seen pictures of if you haven't really ever looked at it on the nickel before. This is a house designed by Jefferson. So, you know, imagine it's the early 1800s, and you pull your carriage or ride your horse up in front of this house. This would have been an extremely impressive person's house to pull up in front of. This is one of the most famous private houses in the entire world. We'll give you just kind of a quick snapshot today of kind of the inside a little bit, and then we'll talk about some more specifics tomorrow. But this is the like front door of Monticello. So like the front door is here, and so this is where Jefferson would put a whole bunch of his artifacts and different things to show people. You'll notice over here there's a lot of Native American artifacts and stuff. The Corps Discovery sent back a lot of different artifacts, and so these would be things that Jefferson could show people. We'll talk during the expedition. One of the things they send back is a live prairie dog. They catch a prairie dog, they put it in a cage, they send it back to Jefferson, and it was here at Monticello. So if you came to visit Jefferson, one of the things he might do is like, hey, have you ever seen this prairie dog animal that they sent back from the Great Plains? And you could like feed the prairie dog and stuff while it was still alive. So this would be like the grand room of Monticello. This is the dining room. So, you know, look at that stunning yellow color on the walls. Very similar color that they used at other famous people's houses, rich people's houses at the time. Very expensive paint there. I want you to kind of take note over here by the fireplace of this door, because we'll talk about this in a second. But this would be where you'd have a formal dinner if you would go to Monticello and meet Thomas Jefferson. Here's an aerial view of Monticello. So here's the front of Monticello, or the lawn area here. So you could look out on the lawn. All right, so we'll jump back into the notes here. This is an aerial view of Monticello. So you can see the house, big open area here. There were some fruit trees and some different things like apples and pears and things over here. This was a garden, and they still grow crops there today. It's kind of a recreated garden that Jefferson had. A vineyard down here. There's some different outhouses and stuff. So kind of an aerial view of what Monticello looked like. In addition to being a lawyer and dealing with architecture, Jefferson also was kind of known for creating different inventions and gadgets and things. It wasn't so much that he wanted to like create something and make like a ton of money. What he did was he tried to look at ways that would make his life easier or more efficient. So one of the things that Jefferson liked to do was to create copies of all of his correspondence, but it's not like today where you could just run down to the copy machine and make a copy of everything. So what he created was a little device here where he could write on one side, and then you can tell that it's kind of like attached here. So every movement that you made with one pen was also made with the other pen. And so when he wrote one letter, he would then have a copy of the letter that he could then keep for his own records. So that's one invention. That room that we showed earlier, this was the fireplace in that room. There was an area below the dining room which was kind of like for food preparation and wine cellar and stuff. So this is a dumbwaiter system. So you would take the pulleys in here, and you could use the pulleys to have your little crate or whatever go down, put some more wine in there, or if you had food or whatever, and then use the pulley to come back up, and then you wouldn't have to have anybody actually come into the room. You could just get another bottle of wine if you needed to for your dinner. This is a device that Jefferson created so that he could read multiple books at one time. So you'd have like 4 different books around the sides, then you could have a book on the top there, and you could just kind of turn it down here on the bottom. There was like a kind of like a Lazy Susan type thing, so you could turn it, and so you could have all these books open at one time. So, very talented musician as well. He played the violin. That was probably his primary instrument. So he would sometimes entertain guests with music. We talked with George Washington about how they didn't really have sports, but kind of the way that you could tell if someone was athletic a lot of times was how they did as far as being a horseman and being able to do stuff with the horse. And Jefferson was a very good horseman. Did a lot of things with science, even though he wasn't officially like a laboratory scientist. He wrote lots of different observations down. Each day he wrote down when the sun came up, when the sun went down, what temperature it was. In his garden, he would keep very meticulous details. We planted peas this day. This is the day we harvested them. We used a certain kind of fertilizer on this group of plants as opposed to this group of plants. And so he would keep all these different records on his garden, his property, those kinds of things. And then also reading. we kind of take books for granted today because they're relatively cheap. Back then, books were extremely expensive because a lot of them were made by hand or hand printed and stuff. He had one of the largest collections of books of anybody in the country, and eventually when the nation, decided to create the Library of Congress, they bought a portion of Jefferson's books to begin that process of creating a library for the country. Now, getting back to the politics a little bit, one of the things that made Jefferson a little bit different than, for example, John Adams before him as president, was Jefferson kind of had this vision on making the United States really kind of like a breadbasket country to the rest of the world. He saw all of this available land, very good land in the United States, and he thought that the United States should really kind of develop itself as a nation of farmers, growing all this food, being able to export all this food and stuff like that. So very kind of like agriculturally based. John Adams was from Boston. He was kind of more into shipping and things like that. So this is kind of a little bit of a shift in how the United States is going to be looking at things. And then the second way that Jefferson was kind of different than his predecessors was also what he thought about what government should be. So Jefferson wanted to make government smaller, meaning that not as many programs, not as many government employees. And if you don't have as many employees or programs, then you can also, not have to collect as many taxes. So kind of in general sense, smaller government, and if you have a smaller government, you don't have to bring in as many taxes. So just kind of a little bit of a different philosophy on what Jefferson thought is kind of maybe opposed to the president that was before him. Yes? Well, Monticello, you got to think of Monticello as almost like a self-sustaining city, so there were still people there. Jefferson had slaves, he had servants, he had other people that lived there. So when he was at the White House, Monticello still existed and still, carried on. It's just that he wasn't there. So, and then also at this time period, sometimes people would, go on a trip and they might be gone for like a month at a time. So it wasn't totally unusual for, sometimes people to not be at their house for a month or two at a time. So. All right, one thing that happens during Jefferson's presidency that's pretty important, it's not something necessarily that Jefferson has anything to do with, but it's kind of important to note. When we talked about checks and balances, we talked about one of the important powers that the Supreme Court has is that they can declare something unconstitutional. So like if there's a law and there's a court case involving that law and the Supreme Court looks at it and says, oh, this doesn't, jive with what the Constitution intends, they can wipe away that law. Well, this had been a possibility for the Supreme Court ever since it was created, but the first time that it was ever actually enacted was in 1803 on a court case called MARBURY v. MADISON. So the important thing about this court case is not necessarily the court case itself or the content of it. It's that the Supreme Court looked at this, reviewed a law, and said, hey, this law is going to be wiped out because it is not according to what the Constitution intended. So the reason why this is important is because it establishes the concept of judicial review. So judicial review means the Supreme Court has the final say in interpreting the Constitution. Now I think on your sheet there it also asks about John Marshall. I won't have you take any notes on that. John Marshall was one of the Supreme Court justices at the time, but you can just kind of skip over the John Marshall part there. I won't have you jot anything down. So again, this is not particularly something that's like specifically attached to Jefferson, but it does happen during his first presidency, his first term of office. And we gave some examples earlier kind of talking about judicial review, about how, even though it might be a law, even though Congress has passed it, the president has signed it, the Constitution is still interpreted by the Supreme Court, and they could declare something unconstitutional. All right, so that's kind of a real quick look at Jefferson. We're going to spend some more time in the next couple of days looking at Jefferson more as kind of like an individual, and then also digging in a little bit to Monticello.